So Ofer said he's going to invest, right? Like,
Yes.
all right. I don't know. I'll come up with a pitch later today. So hi everyone. I'm Justin. I run the field engineering team here, which is a technical team that works directly with our customers and partners. So one of the privileges I have in that is I get to really be on the front lines of how people are using not just our product, but what they're doing in GenAI and RAG generally across the board. And so a lot of times we see folks that get started with just, I'm sort of going to roll my own RAG platform to use for my applications. And so we hear some of the pitfalls of how that plays out. But also because we're building a RAG platform, we've lived through those over the past couple of years. So I want to bring some color to some of the perils that can happen when you are trying to do it yourself. So I'll try to bring in a lot of actual customer stories as well as stories from our own experiences. I'll try to keep it sort of interesting and narrative based here. So, well, before I do that, so like, I think Amr mentioned this. It's easy to prototype something in the RAG space. It's hard to productionize it. And I want to explain some of the reasons why it's hard. Some of those are technical, some of those are organizational, right? We have a series of these pitfalls I'll talk through. Everyone will experience some of these. Some people will experience all of these. It's one of those parts of life. And I'm going to go through each of these. There's a lot of pictures in here. By the way, these are all like ChatGPT generated. So some of them are sort of funny. Okay, so the easiest way to think about the first one, vendor chaos, is you've probably heard the phrase one throat to choke versus many throats to choke. The reality is it's more, there's more than that. There's one support ticket to work versus multiple support tickets to work. Because if any RAG system, there's many steps that have to be there. You have to parse the information. You have to build the vectors that represent the meaning of it. You have to store those. You have to retrieve those. There's an LLM. There's re-rankers. So if you're getting those from multiple people, which is what you have to do when you're building your own RAG platform, it's really hard to figure out like what's breaking and why. It's typically you have to talk to multiple different either vendors or open source communities, even worse, to try to figure it out. And the next one's like one pricing model to build. Those are hard. If has anyone ever tried to do some sort of like sizing and projection model for how much this thing's going to cost me over the course of a period of time? It's hard. You have to make a lot of assumptions, and if you have many different components in the system, some will meter and charge based on storage, some based on tokens, some based on queries, some based on user seats. It can be hard to harmonize all that so you can understand what you're going to spend over the next year or a couple of years. Then lastly, multiple vendors to onboard and manage. Like that's not fun for anybody, the vendors or the customers that are buying them. So the more you have, the more you got to manage. And again, no one likes that. The other one, you get distracted with a lot of aspects of technology and implementation that that are probably not pertinent to your core business, that are not strategic to what you're trying to do. So I mentioned there's lots of components that go into any RAG platform. And yeah, you can get those from lots of different places. It's incumbent upon you to integrate them. But guess what? Each of these tools, they've got their own roadmaps. They've got their own agendas. Some of them you get tested together. Most of them don't. Usually it's just a blog post somewhere to, here's how to integrate this X, Y, and Z thing together to get to some end result. And so that's a burden you have to take on, and you have to own it over time as these things evolve. But invariably there's features that will not exist. That they're like cross-cutting things that they only exist if they can be done across multiple steps of the process. And what happens is you have to build those. So you have to take each of those components and sort of layer on extensions to those to make them work. And I'll give you a good example of, we do a lot with metadata in the platform. You can use it for filtering, for adjusting the behavior, customizing the responses. you actually have to, at the parser, at ingest time, pull out the metadata fields and associate them with the right data elements. Then at the storage layer, that metadata has to be stored in the vectors, in the structured data. At retrieval time, you have to use those metadators, whether you're filtering out information for access control or whether you're, like to Shane's point, biasing the results towards more recent information. But then the re-rankers have to use those too, because the re-rankers are reordering the results, maybe based on the metadata fields. Then the LLM, they also need to use that to give the most customized response based on who's asking the question and which facts from the data are retrieved. Like, that's like one feature that hits 6 different pieces of the process. And so, like, you got to build that if you want to do it on your own. And then at the end of the day, it's like I said, are you focused on what's core to your business, which is building applications that your users want, or are you going to focus on plumbing? At the end of the day, building out a RAG system, like, there's a lot of just plumbing knowledge you need. It's all those components I talked about. Where do you want to spend your time? Another thing that we tend to see is, as time goes on, we'll say the environment grows and scales, it's hard to maintain good accuracy. And some of this is obvious, some is less obvious. So what tends to happen is, as more data goes into a system, where any system that's meant to, like, give answers out, the more the data that goes in, it's typically harder to find the relevant information for the responses. And you don't know this until you're 1, 2, 3 years into a deployment, when more and more data's come in. And we found this. We actually had to put in place automatic index rebuilding to be able to detect when the quality of the results we're giving starts to drop. We need to re-index so that we can make sure that the data is saved in a way that's going to get that quality of the responses back up higher. Again, it's not obvious until you're actually dealing with this in the wild with real use cases. The other thing that tends to happen, we mentioned the needle and haystack metaphor. So the haystack gets bigger with more hay, but different types of hay go in. And maybe it used to be all just pure text information from these nice, clean PDFs. And then all of a sudden we've got a bunch of PDFs with tables in it. Like, we just had a discussion about tabular data. And now the queries need to get a good answer, it needs to extract information from the tables. Well, like, your pipeline needs to handle tabular data well. And then, well, what if we now have audio or video? Like the types of data that goes into that haystack changes. And because there's more data, there's typically more users that want to use it for different reasons. So the types of, we'll say, needle searchers that are trying to find the needles, those change as well. So what that means is you have to have a variety of techniques for retrieving the information, for finding those relevant needles to match what the user is looking for, how they want to use it. And again, none of this stuff surfaces in a prototype or even in a V1 of any real application. Only once you've hit a certain scale in terms of complexity of the data, of the use cases, and certainly volume. Latency, so, there's the whole joke that, like, the millennials, they were just all given, like, everything at their fingertips. Like, you could Google and get any answer anytime. Like, we used to have to go to the libraries and look stuff up. But like, everyone now expects just immediate responses with immediate information. And that's true in GenAI systems as well. It's true of the data freshness. If the data happened 2 seconds ago, it needs to be there when I ask a question about it. And when I ask a question, I better get an answer in less than a second. And it's hard to do that, especially at scale. And what you end up having to do, and we put a lot of effort into this, is we take a lot of learnings from the distributed computing world of the past couple decades, and we've brought that forward to the RAG world. A great example is how we are able to do horizontal scalability, to be able to partition the data so that as a number of people running queries grows, like, they can still get all their answers in less than a second. And this is the sort of thing that, like, you might use some vector database and it can scale, but what about the structured data that's being used for different types of searches that are more keyword style? What about the metadata store? What about the re-rankers? Do those scale horizontally? Like you actually have to build the entire system in a way that scales horizontally. It can't just rely on scalability of each individual component. Again, not obvious until you're in the wild and you've got thousands of users that are now stressing the system. We talked a lot about explainability and hallucinations, so there's not much more to say on that one other than the picture of the guy on the right is a pretty trippy one. That was the guy in New York, I guess, that smelled all the weed smoke that Amr mentioned. So security, we also talked a lot about that. I was having a conversation earlier with Chris, I think was his name. Like a couple years ago when ChatGPT hit the scene, all of a sudden people started knowing about LLMs. It's like everything we learned about security from the previous 50 years was just thrown out the window. It's like no access controls, no nothing, just like these magical tools can answer your questions and do stuff for you. And then I'm sure every InfoSec team and every company and government agency everywhere collectively freaked out because like, oh gosh, like what just happened? And so over the past couple of years, they've been realizing that we can't ignore things like access control. Like that was a good idea 30 years ago. It's still a good idea. And like we put a lot of effort into like the metadata stuff I mentioned. That's the main way that access control is done. But then there's emerging types of threats. And Amr asked about this earlier, prompt injection attacks, tricking the LLM to do what you want it to do, even though it shouldn't do that. And like you have to protect against that. And another sort of non-obvious thing that happens that we found and we're actively working on it is we want to give users the flexibility to let the LLM, to customize how the LLM gives out its responses, right? It shouldn't just be a standard formulaic, here's a one paragraph answer every time you ask a question. Maybe you want to format it differently or get it to use a bit of reasoning and thinking with how it gives a response. But so you want to give users that flexibility, but you also want to protect against malicious intent. And so we're actually working to sandbox the LLM execution so that the blast radius if something goes bad, if there is either a purposeful or accidental problem with the prompt customization, so that's not going to just blow up and affect other users or other aspects of the system. You won't see that until you have real users that are using your system to try to do real use cases. And so if you're owning that underlying platform, you're going to learn that just 2 years in when all of a sudden you have an emergency, security emergency. And the other thing, this one is sort of a fun one. We haven't talked much about bias, but any ML model, any language model, it's biased to the data it was trained on. We're good at sort of countering that bias by ensuring diversity of responses comes in. And I mentioned bias because I realized that apparently ChatGPT is biased to think that any policeman is Steve Martin. I don't know if that's just me, but like that guy looks like Steve Martin from about 15 years ago, probably. So yeah, we'll have to talk to OpenAI about that one. Okay, lastly, language and localization. Again, something that typically in a prototype you don't throw 20 different people speaking 20 different languages at a problem to see if they all get the same good responses. That typically doesn't come up till you have more users in the wild and more data in the wild that comes in that's in different languages. And to have good language, sort of multi-language support and cross-language support, that's one of those cross-cutting things that has to be there at every step of the pipeline. So you're as good as your weakest link in this scenario. If you don't have an embeddings model that's good at generating vector embeddings across languages, then it doesn't matter if you can do good retrieval or the LLM can handle multiple languages. And so we put a ton of effort into making sure that we are multilingual and cross-lingual at every step of the process. I should have built this one out while I was talking, but I'll make this real with an example. It's a very, I think, pertinent example. So a bit of history. My first job out of college was like right up the toll road. It was working with an organization called FBIS. Has anybody ever heard of FBIS? Okay, Bob's nodding, so I had one person. Foreign Broadcast Information Service. They became, in 2005, Open Source Center, which is now Open Source Enterprise or something. I don't know, but it's basically, it's in the Intel community. They would look at open source as in like not information that's not been like spied, basically, like newspapers and radio broadcasts and TV shows and stuff like that from across the world, and sort of mine that for intelligence purposes. They would collect all this stuff, translate it, and have these analysts that would like write reports on it. And so we were working on some system to help manage all that. And armies of translators all over the world, and all these bureaus all over the world. Armies of translators to translate in all these different languages. And I think about now, like today, like no translators needed. Just dump all that into a Vectara, and you can ask questions about all of that, regardless of the language the data's in, and regardless of the language that you speak, and you can get answers. So like that would have just like killed probably 2/3 of their entire workforce. That sounds bad. Not trying to take away jobs, but point being, the power of just handling multiple languages in today's real world with lots of information, many languages, it's very messy. Having these language models that can handle all that variety of information means you can be so much more productive and get more people focused on what matters, which is like analyzing it, understanding it, versus just people translating stuff. So that actually sunk in when we were driving in last night, and we drove. It was the same route I used to take to get to the office, and it hit me that like that whole use case now is basically like one very simple application that you can do today. So that's really the power that this type of platform, but also the universality of the data it can handle and the users it can help, that represents. So anyway, that's it. Thanks for listening. Hopefully your lunch was good, and I'm going to hand it back over to Ofer, who has
Thank you.
the next person up. Thanks.